There are moments in history that feel impossible, stories that sound too extreme to be true. A government ordering planes to bomb its own citizens. A mountain turned into a battlefield between fathers and their country's flag. It sounds like fiction, the kind of nightmare born from tyranny or civil collapse. But this one happened right here, in the United States of America. In 1921, the coal fields of West Virginia became a war zone. Tens of thousands of coal miners, tired of poverty, violence, and injustice, rose up in what would become the largest labor uprising in American history. For nearly a week, ordinary workers armed with hunting rifles clashed with sheriffs, deputies, and private militias funded by powerful coal barons. And when the miners refused to surrender, the government responded with something unthinkable. It sent in troops and bombed them from the sky. The Battle of Blair Mountain wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was fought between Americans, between those who worked underground and those who controlled the ground above. And it remains one of the most buried, misunderstood, and haunting chapters in U.S. history. Before we uncover how America came to bomb its own people, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the untold side of our past, the stories that still shape our present. At the dawn of the 20th century, coal was the engine of the modern world. It fueled factories, powered locomotives, and kept the lights of industrial America burning through the night. But deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where that coal was mined, life was anything but bright. The coal fields of southern West Virginia were isolated, valleys cut by rivers, surrounded by rugged ridges that made travel slow and dangerous. Into these valleys came the coal companies, bringing with them railroads, dynamite, and promises of prosperity. They built towns out of nothing, company towns, where every building, from the church steeple to the saloon door, bore the coal company's mark. To outsiders, this might have looked like progress. To those who lived there, it was a prison without bars. Miners didn't just work for the company. They lived, shopped, and even prayed under its control. Their wages came not in dollars, but in company scrip, tokens redeemable only at company-owned stores, where prices were high and debts were endless. You couldn't move away because the moment you lost your job, you lost your home, your food, and your family's shelter. In these coal camps, law and justice were whatever the company decided they should be. And when miners dared to question those laws, the coal operators sent for the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. The Baldwin-Felts men were not detectives in the way we imagine today. They were private soldiers, mercenaries in tailored suits, hired to keep miners under control. Armed with rifles and machine guns, they guarded the mines, broke up union meetings, and escorted families out of their homes at gunpoint. Their authority came from company contracts, not courts of law. To the miners, these men were not lawmen but invaders. They lived in fortified bunkhouses, rode armored trains known as bull moose specials, and fired indiscriminately when uprisings flared. Every coal camp in the region lived under their shadow. For miners, the conditions underground were a nightmare. The air was thick with coal dust that blackened lungs. Explosions, cave-ins, and fires were common. Children worked alongside their fathers, and widows were a familiar sight in every mining town. In some years, more miners died from accidents than American soldiers in battle. Yet any attempt to organize, to form a union or demand safety, was treated as rebellion. Leaders were beaten, blacklisted, or killed. But in 1919, the world had changed. The First World War had just ended, and tens of thousands of miners had returned home wearing military uniforms. They had fought for democracy overseas. Now they wondered why they had none of it at home. The spark that lit the fuse came on a rainy day in May 1920. In a small town called Matewan, miners gathered to hear a union organizer speak about their rights, about fair wages, dignity, and freedom from company control. Word of their gathering spread quickly, and soon a group of Baldwin-Felts agents arrived by train, armed and ready to make an example. They carried eviction papers for union families, a brutal practice that meant women and children were forced out of their homes, sometimes at gunpoint, their belongings thrown into the mud. But this time, the miners had an ally. Sid Hatfield, the town's young police chief, refused to be intimidated. A former miner himself, Hatfield stood with the workers. When the Baldwin-Felts agents tried to take control of the town, he ordered them to stop. What followed became legend. Shots rang out across the muddy streets. Within minutes, the quiet coal town erupted in chaos. Men diving for cover, glass shattering, bullets tearing through the smoke. When the gunfire stopped, 7 Baldwin Felts agents were dead, including 2 of the powerful Felts brothers. 4 townspeople lay lifeless as well. The confrontation became known as the Matewan Massacre, and its echoes spread through every hollow and ridge in West Virginia. For the first time, the miners had fought back and won, however briefly. Sid Hatfield became a hero. To miners, he was the man who had finally stood up to the untouchable coal barons. But the coal companies saw him as a dangerous symbol, a man who had to be eliminated. 1 year later, they got their chance. On August 1st, 1921, Hatfield arrived at the McDowell County Courthouse with his wife. He was unarmed, expecting to testify in a minor case. But waiting for him outside were Baldwin Felts agents, the same men who had sworn revenge for Matewan. As Hatfield reached the top of the courthouse steps, the agents opened fire. He fell instantly, his body riddled with bullets as his wife screamed for help. No one was ever convicted for his murder. News of Hatfield's assassination spread like wildfire through the coal fields. To the miners, it was the final betrayal, the moment when law itself had been replaced by corporate vengeance. Hatfield's blood became a rallying cry. Within days, thousands of miners began gathering in protest. The long-suppressed anger of a decade exploded into motion. They would no longer beg for justice. They would march for it. The summer heat in West Virginia that year was thick and suffocating, but it couldn't cool the fury that had been building. Across the coal fields, miners met in secret, holding midnight meetings under cover of darkness. They brought whatever weapons they could find: shotguns, hunting rifles, pistols left from the war. They wore overalls, work boots, and red bandanas around their necks, a symbol of unity that would forever mark them as rednecks, a term once meant as insult, but now reclaimed with pride. Their plan was bold. They would march to Logan County, the heart of the anti-union stronghold, where Sheriff Don Chafin ruled with an iron fist funded by coal money. There they would free imprisoned union miners, demand recognition for their union, and bring the coal barons to the negotiating table, or force them to face the wrath of those they had oppressed. The miners set out from the town of Marmot, near Charleston, marching southward through the mountains. As they moved, their ranks swelled. Men left the mines, the rail yards, and even their homes to join. Farmers offered food. Women filled canteens with water and whispered prayers. By late August, an estimated 10,000 miners were on the march, a human tide stretching for miles through the valleys and forests. They carried American flags at the head of their columns. Many of them were veterans who had fought in France only a few years earlier. They believed deeply that this new struggle was no different. Another fight for democracy, for the rights of the common man. But the road ahead was not open. Logan County stood like a wall between the miners and their goal. And at the center of that wall was Blair Mountain, a rugged ridge of forested slopes that offered the perfect defensive position. Sheriff Don Chafin had fortified it with everything he could muster. He commanded about 2,000 men, a mix of deputies, company guards, and hastily armed volunteers. They built trenches, machine gun nests, and sniper positions overlooking every possible route of approach. High on the ridges, they set up heavy weapons, Browning and Lewis machine guns capable of cutting down entire lines of advancing men. And above it all, the coal companies had arranged for something new: airplanes. Small biplanes, flown by private pilots, would be used to scout the miners' movements and, if necessary, drop homemade bombs filled with shrapnel and gas. The miners didn't know it yet, but they were marching into a battlefield prepared for modern war. For a moment, it seemed peace might still be possible. Union leaders and state officials met in Charleston, pleading for a truce. Even President Warren Harding's administration was watching closely, fearing the uprising could spiral into full rebellion. But on the ground, tension was rising by the hour. Rumors spread through the miners' camps that Chafin's men were killing Union sympathizers, that the army was coming to arrest them all, that the government had already declared them traitors. The truth was hard to separate from fear. Then came reports that Chaffin's deputies had attacked unarmed miners near the town of Sharples. The miners snapped. To them, this was no longer a protest. It was war. They advanced toward Blair Mountain, rifles in hand, banners flying. The ridges ahead were lined with gun barrels waiting for them. The battle was about to begin. It started with the crack of a rifle echoing through the valley. No one knew who fired first, but once the first shot rang out, there was no turning back. The miners spread out through the forest, using every tree and rock for cover. Their numbers were vast, nearly 10,000 strong, but their weapons were mismatched and their coordination improvised. They were hunters, not soldiers, fighting against entrenched men with better arms and higher ground. From the ridges, Chaffin's forces opened fire with machine guns, spraying the valleys below. The air filled with the thunder of gunfire, the shouts of commands, and the screams of the wounded. For 5 days, the mountains echoed with the sound of war. The miners tried to advance, crawling through the brush, circling around the flanks, cutting telephone lines and blocking supply routes. They fought with determination born of desperation, but Chaffin's men held the high ground. Then came the planes. Private pilots flew overhead, circling the battlefield. From their wings fell small bombs, crude devices made of leftover World War I munitions, some packed with nails and shrapnel. Others carried tear gas, meant to flush miners out of hiding. They dropped from the sky, exploding in bursts of smoke and fire. For the first time in American history, citizens were being bombed by their own countrymen. Below, the miners endured the assault and kept fighting. They dug trenches, carried the wounded to safety, and shared ammunition between companies. They believed reinforcements from other counties were coming, that victory was still possible. But their supply lines were thin, their food was running low, and the enemy's firepower seemed endless. The mountain that had once given them shelter now felt like a trap. By the beginning of September 1921, the hills of Logan County looked like a war zone. Smoke rose from the valleys where gunfire had raged for days. Bodies lay scattered among the ridgelines, the wounded carried away on stretchers improvised from doors and fence posts. No one knew exactly how many had died. Estimates would later range from dozens to perhaps over 100, but everyone understood that what had begun as a march for justice had turned into open civil conflict, and now Washington had decided to act. President Warren G. Harding, alarmed by reports of insurrection, ordered federal troops into West Virginia. The U.S. Army dispatched nearly 2,000 soldiers, trained men, many of them veterans of the Great War, complete with machine guns, heavy artillery, and reconnaissance aircraft. To many miners, this was the moment of reckoning. They had always called themselves patriots, veterans, fathers, workers who believed in the American promise. They marched under the stars and stripes, convinced they were defending democracy from corporate tyranny. But now, that same flag appeared on the sleeves of the soldiers coming to face them. As the first troops arrived, the miners gathered in emergency councils. Their leaders argued bitterly. Some believed the army was sent to crush them, others hoped it might restore peace. Few were eager to fight the United States government itself. When the soldiers advanced into the mountains, something unexpected happened. The miners began to lay down their arms. For nearly a week, the miners had fought bravely, even against impossible odds. They had faced machine guns, airplanes, and the wrath of their own state. But the arrival of federal troops was a line most would not cross. They were angry, not traitorous, defiant, not revolutionary. One by one, they turned in their rifles. Men walked down the mountain paths carrying white cloths tied to sticks, or simply with their hands raised. Others buried their weapons in the woods, hoping to hide them from the soldiers. Many wept as they left, knowing that the cause they had risked everything for was slipping away. The federal officers disarmed the miners but treated them with a measured restraint. There was no mass slaughter, no final charge. The soldiers knew these men were Americans, veterans, workers, fathers, not an enemy army. When the last gunfire faded, Blair Mountain fell silent again. The great battle was over. The miners returned home, their boots heavy with mud, their hearts heavier still. The uprising, the largest armed labor conflict in American history, had ended in defeat. The aftermath was swift and punishing. In the days that followed, state and local authorities began mass arrests. Nearly 1,000 miners were detained, accused of crimes ranging from murder to treason against the state of West Virginia. Many were held in makeshift jails, courthouses, barns, even schoolhouses converted into holding cells. Trials began in the months that followed. The prosecution sought to make an example of the miners, painting them as anarchists and radicals, dangerous to law and order. But the defense countered with the truth. These were men driven to desperation, men who had been beaten, blacklisted, and bombed by their own employers. The most famous of these trials took place in Charlestown, the same courthouse where abolitionist John Brown had once been tried decades earlier. The symbolism was not lost on the nation. The first miner to stand trial for treason was Bill Blizzard, one of the Union leaders accused of commanding the march. The proceedings dragged on for months, with witnesses recounting the chaos and brutality of the battle. In the end, Blizzard was acquitted, as were most of the miners. The juries, drawn from ordinary West Virginians, could not bring themselves to condemn their neighbors for standing up to the power that had long crushed them. But acquittal did not mean victory. The Union movement in southern West Virginia was shattered. The coal companies used the defeat to tighten their grip. Union organizers were fired or driven out, blacklists grew, and company guards returned to the camps. For a decade afterward, the mines remained under near total corporate control. It would not be until the 1930s, during the New Deal era, that federal labor reforms finally granted miners the rights they had fought for at Blair Mountain, the right to organize, to bargain collectively, and to work in safer conditions. But for many of those who had survived the battle, those victories came too late. For years, the Battle of Blair Mountain was deliberately erased from public memory. Newspapers stopped mentioning it. Textbooks ignored it. The state of West Virginia rarely acknowledged it at all. The coal companies, eager to bury the story, portrayed the miners as criminals and agitators. They hired public relations men to rewrite the narrative, to make it seem as though the battle had been nothing more than a violent outburst of radicals, not the desperate cry of workers pushed to the edge. Even the federal government had little interest in revisiting what had happened. The idea that American planes had bombed American citizens was an embarrassment, a stain on the nation's conscience. And so, silence settled over Blair Mountain like the mist that hangs in its valleys. Generations grew up in West Virginia without ever hearing of the battle. Families who had fought there kept their stories quiet, passing them down in whispers, fearful of retaliation or ridicule. The ridge where the fighting had taken place was left to the forest, the trenches slowly filling with leaves, the bullet shells sinking into the soil. It was not until historians and descendants began digging, literally and figuratively, that the full story began to re-emerge. Wasn't until decades later that historians and local families began to uncover the truth. Artifacts from the battle, shell casings, bullets, and fragments of bombs were found buried in the soil. Old letters and testimonies revealed the courage of the miners who had stood their ground against impossible odds. For the people of Appalachia, the memory never faded. Grandfathers told their grandchildren of the march, the battle, and the dream of fairness that was never realized. The mountain itself became a symbol of both defiance and tragedy. In recent years, Blair Mountain has been recognized as a historic site, protected from mining interests that once sought to erase it. It stands now as a reminder of what happens when ordinary people are pushed too far, and when the system meant to protect them turns its might against them. The Battle of Blair Mountain is more than a footnote in history. It's a mirror. It reflects the tension between power and justice, between profit and humanity. It asks uncomfortable questions about loyalty, freedom, and the price of silence. These miners weren't revolutionaries. They were Americans who believed in the promise of their nation, that hard work deserved dignity, that the law protected the people, not just the powerful. But when those promises were broken, they did the only thing they thought they could. They fought back, and in response, their own government chose force over dialogue, bombs over compassion. A century later, their struggle still echoes. Every time workers fight for fair treatment, every time citizens demand accountability, every time power forgets the people it serves, the ghosts of Blair Mountain stir. History is not just a record of what we've done. It's a warning of what we can become. The question we must ask ourselves is simple and chilling. When a government feels threatened, how far will it go to maintain control? And when justice demands courage, will we have the strength to stand, as those miners once did, against the storm? If this story moved you, share it. Not for clicks or views, but to keep their memory alive. Because remembering Blair Mountain isn't about looking back in shame. It's about ensuring we never have to live it again.